Money Merflin Shnikes Wobble Dabble Wick Wackadoodle Bam Shladoo. Hi everyone, this is the podcast Storytelling Deconstructed. I'm Erik Linnell.
I'm Cody Zervos.
Today we're going to look at the most recent big movie that's been blowing up the Netflix scene, which is El Camino, Vince Gilligan's postlude to his hit show Breaking Bad. Let's dive right in.
Indeed.
So, Cody, I think you agree with me with this, but Vince Gilligan is one of the most impressive writers of television that I've ever seen. One of the things that's impressive about Vince Gilligan is that he only seems to rely on a few different storytelling techniques that he uses over and over again, but he's able to get so much juice out of them that, like, every time, I feel like a sap, because every time I fall for it. So, for instance, one of his techniques that he loves to use is where, like, a character will have a plan of some sort, and he'll just drop you right into the middle of it, and it's just like you spend the first part going, okay, what the hell is this person doing?
Sure.
Like, sometimes if you're a little bit ahead of it, you can get it when they're like 80% done with what they're doing. But like in El Camino, there's this one instance where I didn't understand it until it was like I was way past the sap point. Like, I was already a sap for falling for it.
Right.
And that example was, this was near like that. It was past the halfway point, near the gold ratio part of the movie, where he needs money. He needs money to pay the guy who's going to disappear him, which, like, obviously, if you're picking up the story immediately after Breaking Bad, that's obviously what Jesse would do next. That was obviously his next move. So that wasn't so much of a surprise. But then the way he gets the money was he calls his parents and he distracts them. He tells them that he's going to turn himself in if they come get him at this certain location. And while they and the cops are away, he goes into their house. And so I, like a sucker, go, oh, he's going to get the money from them. And so then when he opens the safe and it's two guns, I kind of went like, wait, did he miscalculate? But then, of course, he's taking the money back from the people who stole the other 2/3 of Todd's money. He does stuff like that all the time, and I always fall for it. And I'm not sure if it's just the fact that technique is impenetrable, like that just as a viewer, there's like no way to pierce through it just by the nature of it being shrouded in mystery because you're being dropped in the middle of it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that you're right. This is something he does all the time. I feel like almost every single episode in Better Call Saul uses this with Mike in all of Mike's plot lines. Every episode, Mike is up to some new scheme, and it's the exact same thing. They just drop you in the middle of it. You have no idea what he's doing. He's hammering nails into a hose or whatever it is, and then you sort of figure out later. This is why I would say it only works as an introductory technique. By that I mean it works to begin an arc because of exactly what you're saying. It is impenetrable for the most part, and so like. It creates mystery and suspense, right? And you're like, what's gonna happen? But you can't rely on that to fuel it like all the way through. At some point, the audience has to catch up, figure out, understand what's going on, and then more traditional sort of techniques have to carry the story from there. Precisely because of what you're saying. Like if you maintained it all the way through, your audience would just be baffled from beginning to end, and that obviously is a non-starter.
Right. Yeah. There. Two things that I don't think help storytelling, even if they're valid emotions, are I don't think there's any justifiable reason for boring the audience, and I don't think there's any justifiable reason for having your audience be confused for more than like maybe a few minutes at a time.
Sure. Yeah, it's amazing how to me I always it's kind of weird because I always kind of turn my nose down. Is that the phrase? What's the expression? Turn your nose up. I turn something in some direction
Yeah.
toward uh, using sort of mystery and confusion, especially in order to create drama and suspense. It always just kind of felt like a little bit of a cheap trick to me. I feel like a lot of hack writers lean on that very heavily. Where it's like they don't actually have very interesting characters or themes or drama or anything. They just kind of go like, we're just gonna make this really fucking confusing and random and weird, and that will keep you engaged. Or we're gonna hide some element of what's going on so it's mysterious, and that is what drives everything.
I think the king example of this sort of storytelling is Chris Nolan's Memento, where the story's told in reverse, right? Because he has retrograde amnesia, right?
Sure, yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, as huge of a fan as I am of Christopher Nolan, sure, I agree with you, that is a pretty good example. For the most part, for the most of the movie, you're just like, what the fuck is going on? And that's what drives essentially the whole movie.
Right. And I think
the core of it is not particularly interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I read a review of that movie by Roger Ebert, who obviously has seen thousands of movies in his lifetime. And he, even on rewatching, he said, yeah, confusion is the objective of this movie. Like, even after rewatching it multiple times, that's still the core emotion.
Sure. And a lot of, especially younger directors and writers, I feel like, do that specifically as a bravado technique to try and kind of show off how complex of a plot they can weave.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah, it's kind of like the equivalent of like a young guitar player just like
shredding.
I was like, look at what I can do, and just shredding on the guitar like a virtuoso. But people are like, okay, but this isn't. And I'm a big fan of Chris Nolan too, and I'm not even dissing the movie Memento too much. That might not be a great example because he pulls it off to some degree. But maybe to use another example that I think is universally agreed upon as being what you shouldn't do is the TV show Lost.
Oh, yeah. That's a great point, dude. That show is the quintessential ultimate example of this. Exactly right. The entire fucking show was all purely driven on the promise of a mystery being revealed and then just postponing that and postponing it and postponing it for years. And it's horrifying. It's terrible when it's leaned on. So I admittedly have a bit of a bias against it for that reason. But I wanted to say all of that to then set up me saying Vince Gilligan is an exception because his use of it is masterful. He shows how you can do it in a non-hack way that it adds to the story and doesn't detract. It's sparing, it's subtle, it's just right. Exactly what you say. He never holds on to it for longer than he should. It's just for a couple minutes to introduce an arc, and it gets you into it. It keeps the interesting level up. It's one thing that it can be used for is it can be a way to sort of either bypass or keep the interesting levels up during exposition.
Yes.
Right. So it's like instead of doing all the exposition that you normally would have needed to, you can skip some of it and create some mystery and confusion that way, or you can fit it in while the mystery and confusion is going parallel, and therefore sort of create some intrigue at the same time and not be boring. So I think Vince Gilligan does precisely that a lot of the time. So he's kind of killing two birds with one stone.
A great example of the former, where it's about exposition, was there's this moment that it was where Jesse was trying to break into Todd's apartment, and there's the guy who's watering all the ficuses, and at first you're like, okay, what is this place? Why is Jesse there? And does this guy watering ficus, is he like, does he have some meaning that is above what is just on the surface? And then he closes the door, and like as the door closes, all of a sudden you're in a flashback to where Jesse is at Todd's place while Todd was alive, while Jesse was a prisoner. So it was almost like a double confusion, but then it was, as that scene played out, all the questions that you had were answered. And I was really impressed with it. I mean, the thing that was, that just Vince Gilligan is so great at is his use of time. Because like he, not only in terms of what story beats to use and the structure of them, but then also he makes people just walking down a hallway really fascinating. And I just love looking at it. And I always have the experience of like an hour feeling like 20 minutes whenever I'm watching anything that he's involved in. That movie flew by so fast in general. Besides just diving into that flashback after Jesse closes the door of Todd's apartment being a good suspense technique, it's also a good example of illustrating Jesse's state of mind. Because throughout the whole movie, he keeps having these flashbacks of when he was Todd's prisoner and when he was, the Nazis' prisoner in general, and they were just humiliating him every day. They would give him showers by just putting him outside and dousing him with a fire hose. He had that bet with the guy who owned the auto part shop about whether or not he could break the what do you call it? The thing that was on his back that made him not be able to escape. And so all of those flashbacks, besides just being pure exposition, they also illustrated Jesse's state of mind, because it's clear that he was dealing with PTSD from those events. And so that was like the phenomenological sensation of how it feels to have PTSD.
Yeah, it's a good point that it serves both those functions. Yeah, I often feel like part of the goal of storytelling is to like be efficient as possible by stacking functions, essentially, almost. It's like the more things that every scene can accomplish, the better. Like if a scene is just doing exposition or whatever, or just doing one thing, that's not as good as if it's doing four things. Like it's doing exposition and it's moving the plot along and it's establishing, character psychology and it's setting up foreshadowing or whatever, you know what I mean? And so, yeah, Vince Gilligan is very good at making his stories very efficient, very compact. Every scene is doing all these things. It's doing so much work.
And with so little, it feels effortless because it almost seems like he's in a contest with himself to how few words each character can say while still expressing themselves properly. So it's like each character, they only speak in like haiku or like one verse of a haiku at a time.
Yes, that's true. Part of what's so fascinating to me about Vince Gilligan is there's a very minimalist feeling that I get when I watch his stuff, in that some parts feel even slow, I would say. And like you said, the characters often don't say much. And there's this feeling of starkness, but so much is happening under the hood. So it's like tons of stuff is happening, but it doesn't feel like it's happening. And the result is that it's a weird feeling that I don't feel like I've really experienced like that anywhere else.
Would you say it's analogous to, because Ernest Hemingway had this idea that he called the iceberg theory, which is that you should only tell your story, you should only give your audience member a glimpse of the vastness of the story that you're telling. It's like you construct the whole universe in your head, but you only give the tip to your audience and let the rest be just like insinuation.
I think Hemingway was more specifically talking about like in terms of world building and stuff, just in terms of like the character's backstory, right? And all the interactions they've ever had with all the characters, things like that, where you don't necessarily need to explain, what happened to the character when they were 10, which is why they are the way they are now, but you know it, and that helps you write it. I think that's more what Hemingway was speaking to. And that's related, but it's a little bit different than what I'm saying, which is that he's just accomplishing so much with so little. Like there's just so much efficiency in his writing, where it can feel like a sequence is going slowly. Like it feels like he's taking a lot of time. Where Jesse is sneaking into Todd's apartment or something. Like that whole sequence. There were several times where and this doesn't really bother me because I kind of like a slow feeling story. But to some people that bothers. Like I've heard some people say they couldn't watch Breaking Bad because it was too slow. But yet at the end of the sequence, I look back and I go, so much got done. So it's like, how can that simultaneously be true that it felt slow and also so much was happening?
So is Jesse breaking into Todd's apartment a good example of that, such that we could break that down further as far as what you mean by, quote, so much happening?
Possibly. It might not be the best possible example, but we can try.
Because
Sure.
what is being filled by that empty space? Just suspense, like where are we, or what else is going on there?
That sequence might not be the best example, but certainly we can apply that sort of analysis at least a little bit. So here's the things I would say that sequence is doing, right? And there may be more, but off the top of my head, it's doing the technique that we talked about, where it's creating suspense and drama through mystery and confusion, right? Exactly what you said. We don't know exactly what's going on at first, where he is, what his motivations are. So that's part of it. 2, it reveals what's important to Jesse, essentially. It's doing some psychological revelation in that how hard he's willing to work for this money. And it's also showing to a certain degree a change in Jesse, in that he is a little bit different person than he was, certainly at the beginning of Breaking Bad. Now, obviously, we saw a bit of an arc in his character in that show too, but I don't know if at any point in Breaking Bad did we ever see him this focused and driven and capable.
No, I think the only time, I mean, is probably because he really didn't come into his own until season 4, when basically Gus Fring took him under his wing, and then he took him as his guinea pig down to Mexico to show off how well he could make meth for the cartel.
Right. But even then, it was like short bursts at a time, right?
Right.
Okay, he was able to cook under pressure or whatever. But this is the first time I think we've ever seen him over a long period of time have a goal, pursue it over a long period of time, come up with a plan, run into problems overcome the problems, right? It was a different side of Jesse that we haven't seen, right? And so like that was also something that the sequence was doing, is it was showing us that for the first time.
Are we now? Because at first I was only including when Jesse had his car in front of the place and he was climbing up the stairs, and then there was the guy watering the ficuses and he closed the door. So you're now also including that long scene when Jesse was searching the place too, right? You're including that as well?
Doesn't that come immediately after?
It's broken up by the flashback that Jesse has with Todd. So it's the same scene, but just...
That's right.
Broken into 2 pieces.
Sure. Yeah, I was including that. Yeah. Right, and then of course there's the flashback stuff, which you already touched on, which that's a whole thing. And so yeah, it's maybe not the best example because this is maybe 3 or 4 things that we just talked about, or 2 or 3 things that it's doing. And when Vince Gilligan is at its best, I can say I feel like there's 4 or 5, 6 things that a sequence or a scene is doing. But it illustrates the point. Just generally speaking, I feel like this is something that's interesting to me about Vince Gilligan. Just tonally, he has such a unique tone to his work, doesn't he?
Yes.
Like every time I watch a Vince Gilligan thing, I'm like, it has the Vince Gilligan tone, and it's a certain feeling.
Yeah, to make an analogy, it's almost like when you hear a piece by a composer, or like just to make it easy, let's say it's a piano work by some composer, and it's like when it's played properly, you can almost hear the composer's fingers playing the keys themselves.
Yeah, I can always tell when I hear Jimmy Page play guitar.
Right. It's the same thing. It's like I can hear how Vince Gilligan's fingers are on the typewriter. I mean, people don't use typewriters, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, on the old stone tablet. Now, I've already kind of got into a little bit, but what do you think characterizes the Vince Gilligan tone? By that I mean, what is the tone? What is the feeling it creates for you? But then, and let's talk about that, what we each think the feeling is, and then let's talk about how he creates that and why.
Sure. Vince Gilligan, he somehow, even in his darkest moments, he's always able to find, I don't know what the word is, it's some mixture of comedy and levity. Because, like, they're not like ha-ha funny jokes. I mean, and of course the master of this was Saul, and in fact it's Saul Goodman is the character that I'm mostly thinking of when it comes to this technique. Just like in Breaking Bad, I remember the moment where it's revealed that Saul did not betray Walt and Jesse, and that Saul was actually keeping Jesse safe by hiding him at the laser tag facility. And just the way that Saul expressed his stress at having to be in this situation to Walt when he was talking about him, and he was using all these like flamboyant metaphors, and then at the end he like bookended it by saying, I'm gonna go play Tetris or something, and then he walks out. Something about that mixture of levity and high drama is something that's essential to Vince Gilligan. So like if I had to find an example of that in this movie, it would be when Jesse was having the showdown with the auto parts guy, and like Jesse, I think he genuinely just wants, he's like, hey, I just need $1,800, give it to me and go. But he obviously has that other gun in his pocket ready in case things don't go the way he wants it to. So it goes back to that thing where you say now Jesse's planning like 3 steps ahead, whereas before he like if that first thing failed him at any other point in his character arc, he would have been like, oh shit, what do I do now? But then, so anyways, to go back to the example, and then the other guy proposes, why don't we have a shootout? And then Jesse just flat out says, and he scrunches his eyebrows, he says, you mean like the Wild West? Or it's like he almost, like, it's simultaneously like, all, like you're on the edge of your seat, like, oh my God, they're going to have a shootout right now. But also like Jesse's just recognizing, like in the moment, it's like, this is kind of stupid that we're doing this in 2009 or whenever the movie is supposed to have taken place.
Right.
And there's something about the mixture of those things that's quintessentially Vince Gilligan.
Interesting that you fixate on that as the Vince Gilligan tone. I thought this is probably why I wanted to talk about this, because I had a suspicion that we would both agree that there's a unique Vince Gilligan tone, but we would disagree about what the epicenter of it was. I totally agree with you that is a thing. I would maybe put it in slightly different words. Maybe say like something like an appreciation of absurdity. Like he's always able to find the little absurdities in the backdrop of desolation and high drama and suffering. And the characters are aware of the absurdities. The perfect example of this, of course, is Badger and Skinny Pete, who are the constant source of that, right? It's like they're drug dealers and also they're like super into Star Trek, right? And so on. They just have a conversation about Star Trek and we love it and it's funny and it's engaging and it's like, why? So is there something inherent about just the idea of just having a little debate about Star Trek that is fascinating? It's like, no. What makes it interesting and funny and sort of unexpected is who is having the conversation, right? And in what context. It's like drug dealers in a drug house in a backdrop of a world where people are killed and there's high crimes and shootouts and right. It's like, that's the world that we're in. But okay. So anyway, but I was going to say though, is that is not where I would locate the epicenter. I agree that that's part of it. To me, what the center of it is it's this feeling of, first of all, his willingness to take time.
Yes.
It's so fascinating to me. It's a masterclass when I watch Vince Gilligan in regards to where he chooses to take time. Because it's like somehow he's able to make it feel like it's going a million miles a second and at a snail's pace, like simultaneously. And it always amazes me how he's able to do that. And so it's like there's times when even I sometimes, as somebody who likes and can appreciate slow stories, even sometimes I'm like, all right, move it along, Vince. But then I look up and he moved it along and I was like, whoa, not that fast or whatever. Like, I don't even mean that as his fault. Like I checked out for a half second and I missed something and I've got to go rewind to 10 seconds or whatever. And it's like, you dumbass, don't look away for 10 seconds. You knew better. And so it's weird because it creates this feeling of like emptiness. There's almost like this cosmic emptiness to it because it's oftentimes a lone character against the world. You know, they're all by themselves. They're trying to execute this plan that's probably not going to work. All by themselves in the middle of the night, under a street light or something, and it's slow, and we're just watching them step by step carry out this plan against all odds. And it has this feeling of cosmic despair almost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There's definitely an emptiness, and part of that is just part of I don't know if this would read in any time period where people were less patient than we are in modern times, because I'm like, people tend to think of like in the 19th century, it's like, oh, there were these long novels and like people had the patience to sit down and read them. It's like, if you put something like this in front of those people, would they just be like, yeah, that's the normal pace of a story, and they wouldn't feel the emptiness just because they have more patience, or if that feeling is universal? But I'm saying that as like, I totally agree with the feeling, and I wonder how much of that is created by Dave Porter's music. Because he creates all these like really ambient, like all the sounds feel like they start and then they're ephemeral. They wisp away like smoke, and he just creates these like soundscapes.
It's a good point. He definitely contributes to that. You forget how important I do forget how important score is to storytelling. But the other thing I would say, there's another part of it. So that's part of it for me, part of what I would call the epicenter. The other part is there's this feeling of, so tied in with that emptiness, there's this feeling of absurd specificity. Like Vince Gilligan revels in weird specificity. And there's so much of that. Saul Goodman, of course, is the ultimate example of this, where he's got all these little quirks. He never says anything in the generic way to say it. He finds a specific, weird, quirky way to say it. But even just on like small stuff, like the one thing that's popping in my head right off the top of my head is not the best example. After the shootout, Jesse kills I forget his name, the head of the crew. Then the other character, that other guy, then he tries to go for a gun and continue this fight. And Jesse kills him, and he lands so that his head breaks through a vending machine and he lands in the vending machine. And he's dead, like half in a vending machine. And you fucking know that was not a decision made by the production designer. Vince Gilligan wrote that in the script. Vince Gilligan wrote that this guy dies in a vending machine. And that's so specific. It's kind of absurd and kind of funny, right? That it's like dying with your head in the toilet or something, Right. And his stories are full of that. It's constant, weird little specificities. Breaking Bad is full of that. Nothing that happens is generic. It's like, how do they get the laptop out of the police evidence holding room? Any other writer, they would have just broken in somehow. Vince Gilligan, they use a magnet truck. And so on and so on. It's so specific. And
that aspect is also what makes the being dropped into the middle of a plan so riveting, because the plans always turn out very specifically as well.
Yes.
In fact,
yes.
Not only the plan that we just laid out that we laid out at the beginning of this episode, where he goes to his parents' house and you go, oh, he's going to take the money. Nope, he's getting weapons so he can go rob the other place. But even, tell me if you saw...
And the way he won the duel, right? The way he won the duel is that it's this specific strategy he used where he had two guns, right? And one was hidden. It's like, who else could have thought of that?
Right.
I did not see that coming. Not even a little bit.
Sure. But then that's a big example. But then even the micro example, after he killed the two guys and he told all the other guys, give me your driver's license.
Yeah.
Did you know why he was doing that?
No.
Me neither, until he finally said, okay, now I know where all of you live. If you tell on me, I'm going to come for you. And so there's that micro moment, too, that he's able to do that.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah. That's a great... And so it's just like, I feel like for me, so much of I don't know if this is true for other people. I feel like for me, so much, not all, but a lot of the difference between bad writing and good writing can be summarized with one word: specificity. More specificity is always good, is always better. And Vince Gilligan is the king of specificity. And there's one last thing I want to identify as what I feel is crucial to the Vince Gilligan tone, or the Vince Gilligan, feeling. And it's hard for me to describe it except with metaphorical language. But the feeling that it creates for me is the plot feels like it's always leaning and teetering off to the side. So it's trying to walk straight, but because it's always kind of falling to one side. And so it never ends up where you thought it was going. Like it can't just walk in a straight line or even a zigzag. It's like this one big like curve, and it never falls over, but it always feels like it's on the danger of falling over. And so it's like it walks in this big semicircle. And so it makes his plots utterly unpredictable, I feel. I'm never able to predict where the next scene is going to be, let alone what the end is going to be. I felt that way in Breaking Bad. It's just like every episode was a complete surprise. I could never predict anything. Because every time you think it's set up to go in one direction, like, oh, okay, it fucking just veers off to the side. But it feels still satisfying. That's so hard to do, I think.
And yet, at the end of it, like, you see all the pieces of the puzzle, and you go, like, how did I not see that coming? Probably the best example of that in all of television is the way that they got rid of Gus Fring.
Yes.
Where it's just like, it was this slow lean so what has to happen for Walt's idea to work? He needs to have certain things align. He needs to get Jesse back on his side, which he does. We find out only in the very last scene of that season that he poisoned Brock with Lily of the Valley and made him think that Gus did it. So he needed that. And then he made a car bomb. And of course, everyone thinks like, okay, there's a car bomb, so that's going to work. But then Gus has a conversation with Jesse at the hospital that somehow tips him off that there's a car bomb. And we don't know what Jesse said that tipped him off until the very end of the season when we learn that Gus, in fact, did not poison Brock. And Jesse says that to Gus, and Gus is like, wait, poisoned? Well, it wasn't by me, so Walt must be up to something. And none of that is said out loud. So it just feels like it just keeps veering and veering until finally there's the perfect thing where it's like Hector Salamanca agrees to have the bomb put on his wheelchair, and he sets it up so that way Gus has to go see Hector because Hector was talking to the police. And Gus also has this bone to pick with Hector. But It's not linear, like you say. It's not linear.
Yeah. Something about it is distinctly non-linear. And part of that is the specificity, that it's constantly hinging on these specific little things that no one can think of but him. There's some little weird specific thing about the way this character is, or the way they behave, or something that they can pick up on that other people can't, or whatever, that is where it turns. And so it makes sense because, of course, it's justified within the story and the character, but it's something weird and specific that only Vince Gilligan's brain can think of, and it's constantly pivoting on those little points. And so I'm never able to predict. And if I would actually say that El Camino was maybe, I think we all predicted the ultimate way that it ended. Mm-hmm. Although I had no idea how we were going to get there. My point just being like, this was maybe the most predictable thing I feel like he's done, and it was still quite unpredictable.
Right. I mean, because what made the ending so great for me was, it was one of those endings that even if you saw it coming, it was going to be really satisfying. But then also it was heartbreaking at the end when he gave the letter to the guy who disappeared him, and he read the letter, and then we only see who the letter is addressed to, and it's Brock. As far as good decision-making goes, Vince had originally intended for a voiceover to read what the letter said, but in the end he decided not to do that. And so it has this really bittersweet, nostalgic feeling to it. So even though we predicted the ending, it's like, okay, he's disappeared, he's in Alaska like Mike suggested at the very beginning of the movie. He's free now. But Vince can't let us just have the resolution. There's this bittersweet nostalgia that it was that emotion while also feeling like, all right, the saga has concluded satisfactorily.
Yeah. Vince Gilligan is just one of these storytellers where I always feel like, maybe more than anybody else, the story is safe in his hands. I never feel like he will sin against his own material. Whereas I don't know if there's a single other writer in existence who I have such absolute faith in as I do in him. Do you know what I mean? Because there are different types of mistakes you can make as a writer. And not to say that I don't think he ever makes any mistakes, but the types of mistakes he makes are, or for lack of a better word, mistake is not the best type of word, imperfections, whatever. They never feel like they're a violation. They never feel like they destroy something precious or damage or even threaten something precious about the story. And it's amazing that he's so, because like it sounds easy now when I say it like that, but Nobody else can fucking do that. Like everybody else, at least occasionally, I feel like is like they do something like, oh, that character wouldn't have said that, or oh, they kind of regressed a little bit there. That felt a little bit bad, or they sacrificed their drama for a cheap joke, and that felt kind of shitty. Like I never feel shitty about what I'm watching when it's Vince Gilligan.
Yeah, exactly. There are very few stories, and when I say stories, I'm including all mediums, TV, books, that both the original story and all the spin-offs, there isn't any other one that's as perfect as the one Vince Gilligan has spawned. Specifically, Breaking Bad, Better Call Saul, and now El Camino.
Yes, it is untarnished.
Yeah, it's like, I remember you had this image once that you told me where you said, it's like, you just want to like have the full thing, like you want to have like the collected works of an author or like the DVD set, and you just want to set it on your shelf, and it's like, this is a masterpiece from beginning to end, and it can just sit there and I can revel in its glory. And the reason you brought up that metaphor is to say, yeah, most things don't do that.
Right. Most things you got to take 2 of the discs out and throw them away or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, and the Breaking Bad universe is untarnished. It's incredible, especially given the volume of material there is now. I mean, there's 3 Better Call Saul. Are there 4?
4.
There are 4 Better Call Saul seasons, 5 Breaking Bad seasons, and a movie, and it's all fucking perfect. Pretty damn near. Now, I do have a few critiques of this movie, which I do want to get to.
Yes.
But they're the type of critiques where I would not say they tarnished the... They're just things I would have done differently, but I don't feel like they tarnish it.
You watched that 13-minute documentary about the making of the movie, right?
Yes.
The Road to El Camino?
The Road to the Road.
Yeah, The Road to the Road. It was, man, I love shows that have, because obviously Walter White was in the movie, but Bryan Cranston, he had this gig on Broadway, so they, in secret, flew him out to Albuquerque, and in that diner scene, they kept it all, like people saw the RV in the parking lot, and they like lied to everyone that came up, and the only people that were allowed on the set were like family members, and this is a cool scene. So I don't know if that's relevant to like praising the movie itself, but
Sure.
It's just like a cool thing.
There's a level of dedication to the project, to the integrity, to the secrecy, to the experience.
Right.
Just to the storytelling as a whole, which is cool. I can tell that how deeply Vince Gilligan cares, not only about being a storyteller that is successful or whatever, but about being a caretaker of experience. He understands the sanctity of the experience in the world of a story, as we're talking about. That there's something that goes beyond just the mere moment that your ass is in the chair and you're watching it. That like it sits in your heart as a holy relic, and that's important. It's part of how people construct meaning and things, and taking care of that is important, and he understands that. Okay, so now we'll move into critiques. I do have a few. An evaluative framework I like to use for art in general is, instead of asking was it good, because that's such a subjective, impossible to answer question. A better question is, did it do what it set out to do? Did it accomplish what it wanted to accomplish? Which is a much easier question to answer. Then there are 2 ways to come at that, because it can or cannot have accomplished what it set out to do. But you could also take issue with what it set out to do. So, and this is an example of one of those times where I feel like it accomplished what it set out to do magnificently and flawlessly. But I do take a little bit of issue with what it set out to do. So my primary critique in that realm is I feel like the whole story was kind of pointless. Here's what I mean. There weren't really any psychological stakes. There weren't really any stakes in regards to Jesse's interior life. It was all just about, can he get the money or not? That was the dramatic question of the whole thing. There wasn't really a character progression. There wasn't really he evolved as a person. His psychology changed. Because all of that evolution happened presumably through Breaking Bad and in the sort of in between. Now we saw, like we were talking about earlier, the instantiation of a somewhat different Jesse, one that's more capable and put together and mature. But that was, again, the result of the entire progression of Breaking Bad. It didn't happen in and as a result of the events that happened in this movie. And so because of that, it kind of makes me feel like the whole thing was like, did we really need to tell this story? Couldn't the entire story have been summarized with one scene, which is the driving off in the final scene where he makes it to Alaska? Because that really tells us everything we need to know. If the whole point of the movie was just to get Jesse to the place where he makes it out, like if there's no interior motion that happens, can't we just kind of skip there? And so it kind of felt like popcorn a little bit, right? That it was fun and tasty, but didn't have a lot of nutrients.
Let me say, if that is indeed the case, it gave the illusion of having nutrients. Like there are a bunch of little moments that I remember. I remember at the beginning of the movie when it insinuated that Skinny Pete sacrificed himself so that way Jesse could escape. And so like these characters that had been mostly comic relief, there was like a quiet nobility to them. And so like that obviously has nothing to do with Jesse's character arc, but there were a few little moments like that made it seem slightly more nutritious than just pure empty calories. I agree with the crux of what you were saying. Like I was satisfied with how Breaking Bad ended. I did not need this movie to exist. It's not in the same way where, and this is a spoiler for Avatar: The Last Airbender, but like at the end of Avatar: The Last Airbender, when Zuko asks his dad, what happened to my mother? And then you just don't find out. It's like, yeah, you need to tell that story in another medium. But in this case, when Jesse drove away from the meth lab at the end of Breaking Bad, I did not have that same feeling. So in that sense, I see where you're coming from.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's how I feel too. I did not feel like it was necessary. I was satisfied with the Breaking Bad ending. And there is a certain degree of resolution that's nice, just knowing that he made it out. It's like, we can, it's and that's how Breaking Bad ended. And this goes, and you're like, okay, right. Happy ending. But it didn't, like, again, from a psychological perspective, the character journey was over at the end of Breaking Bad. And
well, perhaps the most fascinating thing about that aspect as far as the interior character is, everyone seemed to think that Jesse was going to get Brock. And so there was that expectation. Why do you think, because that could have been something that could have been included to add interior journey vibe to this movie. Why do you think they didn't do that?
It's a good question, because I agree. That would have felt way more meaningful than just trying to get money.
Because while you think, let me set this up. Because the thing that humanized Jesse and kept him from just being some dopey 20-something drug addict was he had a genuine affection for kids. It was first... Right. You first noticed it in, I think, season 2, when he has to go get money from these meth addicts and they have a kid. And so while they're being their wacky meth addict selves, he's hanging out with the kid. And at the end of the episode, he basically tells the kid to get out of there after the female character kills the male character with an ATM.
Right.
And then I think the next kid was Brock, when he was dating... Is her name Angela? Brock's mom? I don't remember.
Oh, I totally forgot.
The one most relevant to this movie, considering it shows a lot of Jesse's relationship to Todd, was the moment when Jesse's relationship with Todd went sour was when Todd killed the kid who saw the train heist. So that was tracked throughout all of Breaking Bad. And oh yeah, I forgot about the kid drug dealer who Gus's men killed. I forgot about that one too.
Right.
So there's this whole thing about Jesse's affection for children, and yet Jesse could only bring himself to write Brock a letter. I have to imagine, because Vince is too skilled of a writer to just not do it so that way it disrupts people's expectations.
Frankly, I can't think of a reason beyond just saying maybe it was a production concern. Like, for example, maybe they couldn't get the same actor who played Brock and they didn't want to recast him.
Right. Jesse also inadvertently caused the death of Brock's mother when Todd came and shot her in the middle of the night.
Right.
They did say that eventually they would release the contents of the letter that they had written, that Jesse wrote to Brock. So as much as I like that feeling of bittersweet nostalgia that I outlined earlier, I would be curious to see what Jesse wrote to Brock.
As a side note, I really like when writers do things like that. I think absolutely the right decision was to not show the contents of that letter. I'm trying to think of what the generalized rule is there. It's something like, if you can do it with less, do it with less. If you don't need the extra thing, take it out.
Yeah, I still felt the emotion.
Right, because you still get the full emotional impact. And because like part of if you're reading the letter through voiceover or whatever, it runs the risk of being cheesy. It runs the risk of actually taking away from the emotion, because if the contents of the letter aren't written such that they are heartbreaking enough to be, carry the full weight, it might actually take away. It's that thing where, scary monsters become less scary as soon as you can see them clearly in broad daylight. Right? It's like the equivalent of darkness in a horror movie. It's like the mystery helps, like your brain comes up with scarier things than the writers ever could. It's like same thing here. It's like you can imagine that the contents of that letter are heartbreaking and beautiful and poetic. But as soon as whatever they are revealed, and it becomes mundane and specific. And so for all those reasons, yeah, don't show it. And every time writers make that a similar decision, I'm always like, yes, that is correct. Like, leave this out, leave this out.
If they released the contents of the letter independently, would you read it or no?
Probably not. I would not feel a strong need to.
Sure. So in that case, it might be interesting to talk about, do you think that doing anything with Brock would have lessened the emotional impact of this movie? Or just the fact about not reading the letter?
Oh, just not reading the letter. No, I think actually adding Brock as a much more important element in this movie, and even being the primary motivation of Jesse, if the entire primary arc of Jesse was not to just disappear himself, but to find Brock and do right by him in some way, maybe even escape with Brock, depending on whatever his situation is, that would have felt better to me, I think. Because again, it would have been an opportunity to further his character. This is just a pitch off the top of my head. I'm not saying it's necessarily good, but if part of the arc would have been to him to become somewhat of a surrogate father for Brock, that would have been a new realm for him to explore, right? A new level of maturity that he would have been forced to rise to. And the big part of the movie was him dealing with his trauma, right? As you mentioned, he had PTSD, a lot of flashbacks, a lot of being traumatized. And having to take care of Brock would have forced him to not only deal with his trauma, but in a certain sense to let go of it. Because it is secondary in importance to taking care of Brock and helping him deal with his trauma. And so that would have been a whole thing that he had to go through and deal with. And so that would have been, an example of a way that his character arc could have gone that I felt like would have been satisfying and continued the progression.
So to you, that would have fixed that aspect of that movie?
Yes. And everything else could have remained similar. Right? I mean, it could still be a secondary goal to get the money to disappear both of them. So yeah, so just off the top of my head, not saying this is ideal or anything, I haven't given this any deep thought, but let's say he comes across Brock in one of the first third of the movie, and Brock is in a kind of a shitty place, right? He's either in a foster home or he's been taken in by some fucking uncle who doesn't care about him very much, or whatever it is, right? So then the whole arc is that he has to essentially kidnap Brock and then continue on to get all of this money so that he can escape with Brock to safety of Alaska. And whether or not he ultimately ends up becoming Brock's surrogate father and raising him on his own, or if he just ends up then helping Brock find a better foster family who can take care of him long term, either way, the whole movie then would have been about him trying to right the wrongs of his past, do right by Brock, and he would have been forced to grow through the process. So yes, that's why I would have done it.
Yeah, it's hard to say anything. I agree. Do you think Todd got any sort of redemption in this movie? Because in Breaking Bad, he was a little bit of just a sociopath. And I mean, he even in Breaking Bad, he was still charming. He was charming sociopath. That's I think a lot of sociopaths are charming. That's kind of what makes them dangerous. But do you think? Because I saw something similar in the Todd Jesse relationship as in the Ramsay Bolton Reek relationship in Game of Thrones. And I don't know if you felt like there was a parallel.
Totally.
But it felt to me like Todd was more benevolent than Ramsay was.
Agreed. Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because I had to think about it for a second, but I kind of do. I don't know if redemption is the word I would use, but it did kind of feel like he was revealed to be in this movie maybe not a psychopath, maybe something else that is also despicable, but psychopath might not be the word I would use anymore. Because what I think of when I think of a psychopath is somebody who is, clinically, pathologically incapable of feeling empathy for other people, or even with sympathizing with their worldview. They view people as inanimate objects to be manipulated. And the moment that I'm thinking of that's coming to mind that feels like it refutes that is when they're in the kitchen and he has recruited Jesse to help him hide the body or dispose of the body of his house cleaner who found his money. He has a moment where he laments the fact that he had to kill her, and he says that he wants to, what is it? He wants to
bury her somewhere as beautiful as she is.
Sure, right, something like that. And he's like, she deserves that. And it really felt like he meant it. It really felt like he really did want that for her. And so that felt like he really did have a genuine empathy for her in some weird, fucked up, twisted way. And so it felt like what was revealed is essentially that he's not a psychopath. He's just somebody with a really fucked up moral system.
Yeah, because he also regretted having to shoot the kid. I mean, he was callous about it in Jesse's mind because he voiced his regret, but then said, "Hey, you want to get some ice cream?" or something like that. And that really sent Jesse off the edge.
Right. Well, because I feel like what they were toying with was Stockholm syndrome, essentially, right? That he was creating this situation where Jesse was just maximally tempted to fall in love with him as his captor and stay captive to him forever, right? Because he was so nice. It's like, all you have to do is be my pet rat forever and do exactly as I say forever, and I'll treat you pretty well, right? It's like, I'll give you ice cream, I'll take care of you, I'll clean you. You don't have to make any decisions for yourself.
Yeah, right. That was that moment where he had the gun, and he's just like, come on, Jesse, I was going to get you a pizza and a beer.
Right. And it feels like Todd, in a certain way, does have a genuine kind of affection for Jesse. He looks at him kind of like a pet. It's like, you love your dog. You want to take care of him. You punish him if he disobeys, but...
Right, and also, because what was Todd's goal? His goal was to have Lydia fall in love with him, the crazy, neurotic woman who was distributing the meth.
Right.
And Jesse was making that possible for him by making the meth that was 96% pure or higher. Yeah, those were probably the best parts of the movie, were those scenes between Todd and Jesse.
Yeah, I agree. That is writing that is somewhat intimidating to me because it's very sparse, but it's very effective. There's no, like you were saying, there's no monologues. There's no need to be, but they're really going deep and exploring the psychologies of these characters and the dynamics between those psychologies, but through very little.
So, your critiques of this movie pose a question that I think would be interesting to explore, because the two spin-offs of Breaking Bad, this movie was what's the opposite of a prequel? A postlude? Is that what you would call it?
A sequel?
Oh, a sequel. Whoops. My brain totally just farted on the word. There's this story where I was talking to this teacher, and she said, yeah, this one girl in my class, she's a theatricist, or what's the word I'm looking for? I think you're looking for an actress. So I just had that moment right now. Sequel. Oh my God, that's embarrassing. That's okay though. No, I'm going to kill myself. Anyways, a sequel. So El Camino is a sequel, and Better Call Saul is a prequel, and I can see why people like to do the prequels, because it's much better. It's much more interesting because we already know who Saul Goodman is, but it's more interesting to see how someone becomes Saul Goodman. Whereas in a sequel, presumably the person that you're talking about in the sequel has already gone through the transformation in the first thing.
Right. That's exactly right.
So how, like, the only way you could possibly make a sequel interesting, and what most spin-offs do in general that happen after the original story, is that they take characters that just weren't explored and didn't transform. They weren't in their finished form. The spin-off of All in the Family was the Jeffersons, right? Like that family, they made appearances in the show, but they weren't explored. So they didn't have the same transformation as like Archie Bunker did in the show. So therefore, there's a lot of leeway to explore with them.
Right.
Whereas with Breaking Bad, the whole point of that show is transformation.
Right.
So how do you solve that problem?
That's a great question. That you've hit exactly. That's exactly right. That is the problem with sequels. You're exactly right. And it's extremely difficult. I call this problem the after the sunset problem, because like the typical ending of a story is the characters ride off into the sunset. But of course, in real life, that is not where the story ends. Like they have to then like keep living a life. And I feel like this is a problem just in life in general, just to go off on a tangent for a second, where like our brains crave story structure so much, but our lives are comprised of more than one story. And so we're constantly having, at least I am, constantly having that exact feeling in the context of my own life, where it's like, that felt like the end of the story, but now like I have to like keep living. And it's like awkward.
Yeah, you just want to poof away in a shower of dust.
Right. You want to ride off in the sunset and like the black circle closes around you and the credits roll and that's it.
I think that's one reason why in like sitcoms, in like romantic comedies that are a series, first movie is guy, girl, they fall in love. Like by the end of the movie, they have their struggles and then they fall in love and that's the end of the movie. Then the next movie, they have to break up that couple. And then there's either a new girl or they have to get back together. Because anytime, I don't know if you feel this way, in a sitcom where it's just a couple and their struggle is maintaining it, it can get pretty intolerable to watch.
Oh, yeah. Because you have to maintain integrity to one of the top rules of storytelling, which is no coming back to life, which is the rule that you can't go backwards. You can't change things that have... So once a character progression happens, you can't just be like, oh yeah, that didn't happen now, or we have to regress. Characters cannot regress, which is exactly what you're talking about, the problem of a lot of romantic things where it's like they finally get together and then they break up again, which is a form of regression. It's like that problem, that conflict, the conflict of them being apart and coming together has already been solved. We can't retread old ground there. It's so unsatisfying. It's a violation. So what's the question?
Yeah, how do you solve
that?
Yeah, because it's like, okay, like now...
Okay, so you outlined one solution, right, which is, right, as you said, it's like explore some other territory which hasn't been tread. But if you want to use the same characters, there's only one option, and that is you have to find what is next. You have to find the next story, and it has to come after what came before. I don't mean literally chronologically after. Obviously, El Camino comes literally chronologically after. I mean psychologically, dramatically after. So we have to start. So if story 1 is about getting the character from A to B, story 2 has to be about getting them from B to C. So this is exactly what I was talking about. This was baked into my suggestion earlier. So this is what I was saying. So if, let's just say, the progression for Jesse in Breaking Bad was from point A of being a, sort of immature, naive, miscreant drug dealer to being a little bit more wise, a little bit more hardened, a little bit more mature, but traumatized adult, then that's his point B. The B to C could have been getting over his trauma such that he's able to take on the responsibility of caring for a child, because that requires, to a certain degree, putting aside your trauma. You cannot be so traumatized that like you space out and you go have these flashbacks and you're incapable of, like, you have to be able to put that aside to a certain degree in order to be able to care for another person's needs, right? And so it's like getting over that trauma could have been a big part of the arc, and taking on responsibility for a person beyond himself. Because so far, even if he's capable now, there's a big difference between being responsible for yourself and being responsible for another person. That could have been a whole nother level of...
So to play devil's advocate a little bit, for a lot of people, I would assume one of the thrills of this movie, emotionally, was we have not seen Jesse in this psychological manifestation for any extended period of time. And so it's almost like we're watching a new Jesse, and even though he's not transforming, just the fact that this is a Jesse we have not seen yet could be seen by, and is, I think, seen by a lot of viewers as thrilling. Is that a valid thing to you,
Sure.
or does it need to transform?
I think it is valid, but it's not enough to carry an entire movie. So what I would have done is I would have tried to take that feeling and condense it into the first act. So still give us that feeling. I don't want to take that feeling away, but do it faster. Try to get the entirety of that feeling in a shorter amount of time. So if we can fully have that feeling realized within the first act, then now we have the latter 2 acts of the movie to now move beyond that and go to the next thing. So, for example, I think that there were some parts of this movie that didn't need to be as long as it was. I think you easily could have shortened a good amount of this movie. They spent like a good 5 minutes or something like that just showing him turning out Todd's apartment, looking for the money. Like, right? It's like, we don't need that. It's fine. I'm not critiquing it, but I'm just saying we could have shortened this movie and we could have gotten through a lot of what's in this movie in the first act. And then the latter 2 acts could have been interspersed with Brock stuff.
Sure. It is pretty amazing, though, that, and I think you said you feel the same way, that even though there was no transformation, I was never bored.
Well, there's a difference between not being bored and, like, that's the absence of a bad thing. But there are higher heights that art can strive for other than just not boring you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I would not call this movie the height of what art could do. I wouldn't even say that that's what it is in Vince Gilligan's canon. He's proved himself way better in other instances.
Sure. And that's why I prefaced all of this by saying, like, the type of critique this was, which is that it doesn't tarnish anything. It still the movie is still very good. So, like, this is the difference between, I feel like, yeah, this is how he could have maybe tried to take it to that next level, where it's like, it's not just entertaining, it's artistic. And I'm not saying it wasn't artistic as it is. I'm just saying, from great to amazing, or from good to great, or whatever, to really eke out everything we possibly can from it, every ounce of meaning.
Like, this movie didn't need to exist, and now that it exists, I'm glad that it does, because it did exactly what it set out to do, and nothing more and nothing less, and I'm fine with it. Like, I just based on the framing of it in my mind, and I don't know if it was framed by other media or just my own expectations, but I didn't expect it to be the height of the whole Breaking Bad universe. I thought it was going to be fun, and it was like 4 clicks above fun.
Sure.
So in that framework, I don't have any critiques. And I agree with everything that you've said as far as where it could have gone. But ultimately, I'm pretty satisfied with it. Just based on watching the documentary after it, whichever artistic medium I find myself in, I hope that someday I can have a artistic family in the same way that show had. Because, like, even the documentary after, didn't that just make you excited to want to, like, make stuff so that way you can have something like that in your life?
Yes.
Just, like, everyone excited to, like, jump on board a vision, and they all, like, are using their decades of skill to make a vision succeed. I'm so envious of that.
Me too. Just the, like, opportunity to work with the best people in the world. It must be so fun. It must be exhilarating. Yeah, just like every day to, like, to watch them do awesome shit around you. And then, because it fuels your own creativity. You're like, well, fuck, that's amazing. That gives that gives me 10 more ideas.
So we touched on that. Crowd work done. Boom. That's one of my favorite Dimitri Martin jokes. He's just telling jokes, and then he just looks at the audience. He's like, hey, man, what's up? Oh, good, man. Where are you from? Sure. All right, thanks. Crowd work done. Boom. You know what I just noticed? It almost feels like every time a new arc is introduced with new characters, there's a new like character world. There are always like two characters that are comic relief. So like in Jesse's life, it's Skinny Pete and Badger. With Better Call Saul, it's Huel and whoever Bill Burr's character was. I feel like the Nazis had a few people there that were just comic relief.
That's a trope in all of storytelling, though. R2-D2 and C-3PO in Star Wars, Fezzik and Inigo in Princess Bride. There's a million examples of that, right? The comic duo that sort of round out the trio of characters, the main character being the serious one, the two other guys being the comedic relief.
I like that trope sometimes.
It does work. Sokka and Appa.
Oh my god, when I was seriously just like depressed when those many months when Appa was gone in Avatar, it just killed me. Oh my god. Like it affected my real life. That's how bad it was.
Yeah, storytelling is sacred. Stories are meaning porn. And that's serious biz because they inform how we construct meaning. All right. Well, thanks everybody. That was our second or third. That was that episode of Storytelling Deconstructed. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found our analysis useful. Feel free to leave a comment or whatever if you have a contribution to make. I will go read all your comments. And I hope you tune in next time. We're going to be talking about Rick and Morty, season 4.
Stay tuned.
See you there.
And stop.